Today, again, I find myself discussing as first and main topic of a program the conflict in Ukraine, though it's clear that important developments are taking place elsewhere, and I'm going to express an opinion that this may also have been, as well as a decisive week in terms of US West-Russia relations, it may also have been a decisive or at least an important week in the US presidential election as well. But anyway, let's first focus on Ukraine, where lots of important things have been happening. And the first thing to say is that we can now say unequivocally and beyond any doubt that there is indeed a Russian offensive underway in Kharkov region. In fact, the Russian Defense Ministry has just confirmed as much as I am making this program. Now, it has confirmed the capture of various settlements in Kharkiv, and it's given a list: Borisovka, Ogurtsovo, Pletenevka, Pilnaya, Strelechia, and apparently there are others which have been captured as well. Some are suggesting that as many as 12 villages along the border have been captured by the Russians over the course of the first day of the Russian advance into Kharkiv region. And there is a rather dramatic film made by apparently a construction worker on a crane in Kharkiv city itself, looking towards the border, looking towards the village of Lipsy, and you can see a column of smoke rising, which is clearly locates where some of the fighting has been taking place. And yesterday, late in the evening, Russian telegram channels were saying that the Russians have occupied around 40 square kilometers of territory along the border. So far as I can tell, resistance so far from the Ukrainians has been scattered and the fighting has been relatively light. I gather that the Russian forces that were involved in the operation were relatively few. Some are suggesting that only 5 battalions of infantry were involved, and apparently tanks and armored vehicles did not participate in this first day of the operation to any great extent. It's likely that Ukrainian fortifications are located some distance from the border areas. Presumably they were built beyond Russian mortar range and things like that on the border. So this is the first day of an operation. We don't yet know exactly what the Russians are planning or what they intend to do. But anyway, the Russians have advanced. I get the sense there have been relatively few losses on the Russian side. There are some pictures already circulating of Ukrainian soldiers having been taken prisoner, but one way or the other, an offensive clearly in some form is underway. There is a great deal of speculation and discussion as to what the purpose of this offensive ultimately is. Is it, as various Ukrainian officials and military officers are now reassuring each other, simply a diversion, an attempt by the Russians to get the Ukrainians to divert troops away from the main front, the area in central Donbas, where Ukrainian defenses are collapsing, and where, by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry has just confirmed that the village of Keramik in the Ocheretino area captured by the Russians a week ago has indeed been captured. Is that what this is all about? It's just a diversion and a pinning operation, a feint to keep the Ukrainians preoccupied with the Kharkov border, even as the Russians focus their energies principally on Donbas? Or is it the start of something altogether more ambitious? Well, I think that the information to decide that at the moment simply does not exist. Yesterday, I said that claims were circulating that from the Ukrainians again, that the Russians had concentrated around 55,000 troops in the area of the Kharkiv border. And I made the point that I thought it most unlikely, that all but inconceivable, that that would be a sufficient force to capture the whole of Kharkiv region or even Kharkiv city. I would have thought that far more forces would be required in order to do that. However, it's worth remembering that the Russians now are in that position where they do possess those forces. They're in a position where they can chew gum and walk the pavement, as I believe the expression goes, all at the same time. They can attack in multiple directions. They probably now outnumber the Ukrainian army. The Russian army engaged in the conflict now probably is bigger than the Ukrainian army, which, by the way, has not always been the case over the course of this conflict. In 2022 and 2023, the Ukrainian army outnumbered the Russian. But now it seems that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians. And they don't just outnumber the Ukrainians, they're far better organized, far better equipped, they have abundant artillery, they dominate the skies, their drones are everywhere, and they have huge reserves accumulating in the rear, with their recruitment apparently still continuing at the rate of 1,000 men a day, which has been the case ever since the start of 2023. So in theory, or so it seems to me, if the Russians were minded, they could conduct a much bigger offensive in Kharkiv region with far more troops than those that they have deployed to the area up to now. Or they could decide that the moment has come to concentrate still more troops in that place where the breakthrough has taken place in central Donbas. I've been talking until recently about the area between Marinka in the south and Chasov Yar in the north. Perhaps a more accurate way of describing it would be a gap which is now starting to develop between the town of Pokrovsk and all the way north and east towards Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar. A major hole now starting to appear in the Ukrainian defenses in central Donbas. So maybe the Russians are in a position to attack in both places at once, to send troops to exploit this breakthrough, even as they send more troops to exploit whatever they've achieved in Kharkiv region. And now we've had some further information of a very tantalizing and very interesting nature. Now, some months ago, a picture appeared, a photograph appeared, published by the Russian Defense Ministry, by the way, which showed Russian troops apparently on the east bank of Kherson region, training, and the film of them training included pictures of PMP pontoon bridges. This is an enormous type of pontoon bridge developed by the Soviet Union intended to enable large forces, armored forces, to cross rivers in the absence of bridges. It's by all accounts, it was by all accounts a major breakthrough in this kind of bridge construction when it was developed, I believe, in the 1960s. But anyway, Russian troops apparently training to operate this kind of bridge. And, well, where will the Russians need to build a bridge like that? In the area of the conflict? Well, the only obvious place was the Dnieper River. And, well, that might have suggested some kind of Russian plan eventually to recross the Dnieper River somewhere, to move on to the west bank of the Dnieper River and to launch an operation there. Maybe that was the plan, but we heard nothing more about that for a few months until yesterday, when the Russian Defense Ministry provided a further report, this time about Russian Navy Marines training again on river crossings in the area of the conflict zone with this pontoon bridge kit. Now, many people are assuming that this is a plan by the Russians to cross the Dnieper in Kherson region and to reoccupy Kherson city. And there are some reports today that the Ukrainians are now becoming worried of a Russian advance on Kherson city and are now establishing defensive positions in the city and are preparing the city itself for street fighting. Maybe. Or it could be that the Russians are planning some kind of cross-river operation in some other location. Perhaps what they're planning to do is to destroy the Dnieper bridges, which I've discussed in the past, trap the Ukrainian army on the east bank of the Dnieper, destroy it in detail, and then when that's been done, that's when they're going to deploy their bridge and cross the Dnieper. And maybe not in Kherson region, maybe somewhere else. Who knows? Or maybe, just possibly, this is all again the Russian Defense Ministry teasing the Ukrainians, keeping them guessing, making them uncertain about what the Russian plans are, leaving them wondering about what the Russians intend to do. The Russians now are strong enough that they can engage in these kind of mind games, and they've shown consistently over the last few weeks and months, going all the way back to the defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive in the autumn of 2023, that they have become very adept at playing these mind games. Indeed, the Ukrainians did not, for example, expect the Russian attack on Avdiivka, which began in October. They did not expect the Russians to go immediately on the offensive after Ukraine's own defensive was defeated. They did not expect Avdiivka to fall as suddenly as it did, or the attention immediately following the fall of Avdiivka was on possible Russian advances to the west of Avdiivka, towards Pokrovsk, and then suddenly the capture of Ocheretino took the Ukrainians completely by surprise, and it was clear that they hadn't prepared proper defenses there. And now we see the Russians, and we're going to come to that in more detail, taking further action in this precise area, keeping the Ukrainians guessing, uncertain about what they intend to do. And, well, that is, of course, part of strategy. It's part of the operational art that Jacques Beau, in particular, discusses in such detail in his book on the Russian art of war. So it could be that the Russians, this operation in Kharkiv region, might serve all sorts of purposes. It could be intended to establish a buffer zone along the border. It could be that the Russians are opening a new front and are forcing the Ukrainians to commit troops to it. Even if the Ukrainians say it is only a diversion, they can't take the risk of just ignoring what the Russians are doing in Kharkiv, because in that case the Russians can just go on advancing and can capture still more of Kharkiv region unopposed. And perhaps the Russians also saying to themselves, well, let's wait and see how the Ukrainians react. Will they rush troops to Kharkiv region to try to hold us back there? In which case, maybe it's better for us to maintain our focus in other places, perhaps Chasov Yar, or maybe Ukrainian defenses are so brittle that a good opportunity has arisen in Kharkiv region to make more advances and to increase the pressure and to break through, hastening the end of the war in that way. One way or the other, whatever it is that the ultimate Russian plans are, the very fact that the Russians have now re-established a presence in Kharkiv region means that the Ukrainians now have another front to worry about. And this brings us back to the utter folly of what Zelensky and Budanov were doing by those attacks on the Russian border villages in Belgorod region and by those attacks and strikes on Belgorod city itself. Because the Russians have now been given the perfect excuse to reactivate a theatre which, after the Russian withdrawal from Kharkiv region in the autumn of 2022, had been relatively quiet and which the Ukrainians had a strong interest, I would have thought, in keeping quiet as well. Now the Ukrainians must face the fact that the Russians have re-entered Kharkiv region in force. Once again, they are close to Kharkiv city, and perhaps before long, they're going to move even closer. And even if the Ukrainians do say that this is all a diversion, as I've said already, they can't just say that to themselves and forget about this theatre. They're going to have to deploy forces, men, machines, ammunition, all of them in short supply, to try to hold positions in Kharkiv position, men, machines and ammunition, which they would have been better advised concentrating in the defense of Donbas. All those pointless attacks on Belgorod, all that they have done is bring down upon the Ukrainians another Russian force in Kharkiv region, which is something the Ukrainians absolutely, or so it seems to me, did not need. I said many times that Budanov's James Bond operations, in which I get the sense that he's encouraged by the Americans and the British, are completely counterproductive. And here we see a further example. Anyway, there we are. The Russians are now back in Kharkiv region. They've occupied 12 villages. As I said, I suspect those villages were deserted. I doubt that the Ukrainians intended to defend them, but the Russians have occupied 12 villages. Bear in mind that when the Ukrainians launched their incursions into Belgorod region, They were unable at any point to capture a single Russian border village. The Russians have just captured 12. I'm not saying this is a decisive win, but it is a comparison, and it does give us a sense of where the balance of military power actually lies in this conflict now. Anyway, the Russians have captured 12 border villages. They've captured 40 square kilometers of territory. They've moved closer to Kharkiv city. They are apparently close to establishing some kind of semicircle or partial encirclement of the important border town of Vovchansk. There are some speculations that they intend to capture Vovchansk, which would be, again, an even bigger blow for Ukraine in Kharkiv region. And General Syrskyi and his officials in Kiev have been landed another headache, which they have emphatically didn't need. I understand that Zelensky's comments yesterday about the start of the Russian offensive in Kharkiv came across as depressed and pessimistic. He himself looked run down, apparently, and pessimistic as well. I haven't seen film of him. If so, then that doesn't surprise me. But if so, let me repeat, he, at least in part, has himself to blame. He and Budanov should have known better and should have left well alone in this region, where they now find themselves facing the Russians again. Well, let's move on. Let's discuss what's going on in the main part of the battlefronts. And here again, the news is very bad for Ukraine. Now, late yesterday, we got confirmation, or at least information, not yet confirmation, but I'm sure that this news is correct, that the Russians have now captured or occupied the whole northeast area of Krasnogorovka. Allegedly, only a low-rise area of Krasnogorovka to the northwest continues to be under Ukrainian control. I don't know, by the way, whether the Ukrainian troops who were previously in this northeastern part of Krasnogorovka, the troops that many reports said had been trapped, actually managed to escape. Perhaps they did. Perhaps they surrendered en masse. We haven't yet heard that information, but it seems that the Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka have been significantly reduced, and it is very likely that Krasnogorovka will fall probably within the next couple of days. So, long battle of Krasnogorovka, by some estimates, I would say actually on the contrary, a relatively short battle for Krasnogorovka. It began in earnest after the fall of Avdiivka in February. That's when the Russians started to concentrate on their operation in Krasnogorovka. And we've seen that Ukrainian defenses in Krasnogorovka, an important fortified town, have unraveled in just a few weeks. And by the way, again, I get the sense that Russian losses in Krasnogorovka have been relatively low. So Krasnogorovka is about to fall. We've also had further reports from Nitailovo, a village to the west of Avdiivka, part of this latest defense line that the Ukrainians have tried to cobble together along a whole series of water barriers, as they were called. It looks like that's about to fall also. Apparently this film, I haven't seen the film, but I heard about it, film that shows the Russians in the central area of Nitailovo. It looks like Ukrainian defenses in Nitailovo are disintegrating. The Russians captured Umanske further to the north some days ago. It looks as if Natalovo also is about to fall. Yasnobrodovka, the village between these two villages along this defense line, looks undefendable. Most likely this next Ukrainian defense line is about to collapse also. If, or rather when it collapses, which could be within the next week, it's completely unclear to me where the next defense line that Ukraine can fall back to would actually be. People who have better understanding of these things than I do perhaps can answer that question, but I've not yet seen anybody provide a clear explanation of where they think that the next Ukrainian defense line, net west of Avdiivka, would actually be. And these other villages to the south and to the southwest and northwest of Ocheretino, Novoalexandrovka, Novopokrovska, and Novoselyivka Persha. If the southern defense line collapses, well, I would have thought that they're going to collapse as well. Presumably, with Novoalexandrovka having fallen, the Russians would be in a position to move on to capture other villages like Sokol and Progress, as well as I said, Novoselyivka Persha and Novopokrovska. And, well, suffice to say that when that happens, the towns of Mirnograd and Pakrovsk suddenly don't look so far. The possibility of a Russian advance towards these two important towns in Donbas, well, it suddenly begins to become at least feasible or possible. And of course, beyond Pakrovsk, we're starting to move towards a completely different city, a completely different town, Pavlograd, and that then brings us eventually to the Dnieper River, if Pavlograd were to ever be captured by the Russians, and to the cities, the great cities of Dnipro and Zaporozhye, which are key to Ukraine's whole defense position. So I'm not saying that we've got there yet. That's a long way off. But anyway, it looks as if the latest defense lines to the west of Avdiivka are collapsing. And of course, that doesn't in any way take away the possibility of Russian advance westward, eastward rather, northeastward. It seems that the Russians, even as they advance on Novoalexandrovka, and of course they've now just confirmed, the defense ministry has just confirmed that Keramik has also been captured. The Russians are apparently aiming to capture the village of Kalinova on the to the north. This is another village further north along the H20 highway. If Kalinova is captured by the Russians, then there's another village apparently just to the north of it called Stara Nikolaevka. But importantly, the Ukrainian-controlled villages immediately to the west of the H20 highway, Alexandropil, Pantelimonivka, and Sukha Balka start again to look vulnerable, and that puts the Russians in a position where they can threaten the Ukrainian troops west of the Russian-controlled city of Gorlovka. They can threaten encirclement of those Ukrainian troops, places like Toretsk and New York. And the moment that happens, we are then in a situation where the Russians come close to Konstantinovka and to Chasov Yar and are able to attack those towns from the southwest, even as they continue their offensive against these towns from the east. So one can see how, putting aside what's going on in Kharkiv region, the entire defense system in Donbas is gradually coming apart. Fall of Ocheretino has been a disaster for Ukraine. It's unpicked the entire defense line. The Russians have been exploiting, taking advantage of the opportunities that the fall of Ocheretino has given them. And we can see that by taking Ocheretino, and before then by taking Avdiivka, the Russians, over the course of this ongoing offensive, which, to reiterate, began in October, have already achieved major results. Now, I mentioned Chasiv Yar, and predictably, as night follows day, after statement after statement from Ukrainian officers, Ukrainian officials, Western commentators, Western reporters, General Pavlyuk, who is now the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, has now just issued a statement saying that the fall of Chasiv Yar would not have any great strategic importance, that it's just another town that the Ukraine can defend in other places. It would not achieve any sort of decisive outcome. Now, there's a number of points to make here. If that is correct, then General Pavlyuk ought to advise General Syrskyi and President Zelensky that, in that case, Ukraine should withdraw from Chasiv Yar, because it is clear that the Ukrainians are suffering very, very heavy losses by trying to defend this town. The second thing to say is that General Pavlyuk saying that is going to make, I suspect, Ukrainian troops who are dying in Chasiv Yar wonder what the purpose of their sacrifice is. If Chasiv Yar is so unimportant, why are they fighting there? Why are they being killed and wounded in such numbers, being bombed and shelled by the Russians, trying to defend this place? And the third point to say is that quite clearly General Pavlyuk is only saying this because he believes that Chasiv Yar is going to fall to the Russians. And he's now in the business of preparing the Ukrainian public and the Western public and Western governments for that fact. Now, that is important, but of course it is all the more important because if Chasiv Yar does indeed fall, Konstantinovka, the town immediately to the west of Chasiv Yar, becomes undefendable. The other town of Alexiova Druzhkivka also becomes undefendable as well. And, well, the whole situation begins to collapse for Ukraine again it becomes clear that the Russians not only have an open road, again, towards Pavlograd, but also to Dnipro and the Donetsk River, as some Ukrainian authorities, officials are now saying, and the two towns of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk look incredibly vulnerable. So, General Pavlyuk is perhaps signaling that Ukraine's operational crisis is soon, very soon, going to get very much worse indeed. Now, what is actually happening in Chasiv Yar? And the answer is that it's not very clear, because the information that's coming through is, covered very heavily by the fog of war. The reports, for example, about a week ago, that the Russians had withdrawn from the micro-district. This is the micro-district immediately to the east of the Severodonetsk Canal, which bisects Chasiv Yar. Then there were other reports that they had re-entered the micro-district. Then those reports were denied. Then there are reports that fierce fighting is taking place inside the micro-district. Then there were reports that Ukraine had rushed troops from the central part of Chasiv Yar to the micro-district. Some suggestions that the Kraken Special Forces Unit was amongst the troops that had been sent to the micro-district. It's not entirely clear what exactly has been going on, but my own guess is that the Russians have always maintained a presence in the micro-district, and that the reports that they withdrew and then went back in again were probably wrong. The same, by the way, was said about the fighting in Krasnogorovka, that the Russians had withdrawn from an area to the southeast of Krasnogorovka that they'd occupied. And then, of course, a short time later, when they were seen to be there, it was assumed that they must have returned, but I think it's more likely they were there all along. But anyway, the important point is that I think that the Russians are in the micro-district. I think throughout this entire period, when people have been saying that the situation in Chasiv Yar has been relatively stable, that the Russians have been bombing and shelling Chasiv Yar, but have not been making any real attempt to storm the town. I think the reality is that the Ukrainian position in Chasiv Yar has been steadily deteriorating throughout that time. There is good reason to think that the Russians have now occupied positions along the Seversky Donetsk Canal, west of the micro-district, and that they've, in other words, completely cut off the micro-district, not just from supplies, but that they're able to attack it from multiple directions. And I suspect what happened was that, as they always do, the Ukrainians decided that for some reason they needed to defend the micro-district. They continued to send troops and equipment into the micro-district long after it became clear that it was undefendable. The Russians have allowed the Ukrainians, or permitted the Ukrainians, to do that, and then they moved and tightened the encirclement of the micro-district, trapping a large number of Ukrainian soldiers there. Perhaps the Kraken Special Forces Brigade, a unit amongst them, and that they're now moving to take control of the micro-district. And this is perhaps what has alarmed General Pavlyuk and the Ukrainians, and is what explains General Pavlyuk's announcement that Chasiv Yar is not that important after all. If, or rather when, the Russians do capture the micro-district, it will not, of course, mean the fall of Chasiv Yar. The main town lies to the west of the Severodonetsk, of Seversky Donetsk Canal. But it will bring the moment of the fall of Chasov Yar very much closer, because the Russians will be fully in control of the east bank of the Seversky Donetsk Canal. There are lots of places, apparently, where the canal goes underground in tunnels, so it's possible for mechanized units, tanks, and armored vehicles to cross. You don't need to set up bridges or anything of that kind. So I think that with the Russians in full control of the east bank of the canal, they'll be able to move forward and attack Chasiv Yar from multiple directions. And also, of course, their forces, having in effect captured the eastern district of Chasiv Yar, will be able to dominate the rest of Chasiv Yar with their artillery and their drones and all that kind of thing. So bring it under fire control. So General Pavlyuk's words might suggest that the situation in Chasiv Yar is much worse than we've been led to think, and it could very well be that there's an operational crisis developing in Chasiv Yar as well. In which case, no wonder Zelensky is as glum as some people have said. Now, the United States has just announced another aid package for Ukraine, $400 million. This is out of the $13.8 billion, which was the amount that had been appropriated by Congress specifically to provide equipment to Ukraine. This will apparently include Patriot missile interceptors and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. The Bradleys, I should say, are now burning on the Ukrainian battlefronts at an accelerating speed almost every other day now. There are pictures and claims from the Russians that they've knocked out more Bradleys. So if the United States continues replacing Bradleys as they are lost, well, it will soon start to affect the total Bradley inventory, though I accept that is quite large. Of course, the Patriot missile inventory, as we know, is not that large in the first place. But anyway, one way or the other, the United States is going to rush equipment to Ukraine, but I don't think it's either enough or of the kind that would change the situation. If we're talking about Patriot missile systems, there were claims the other day, just about a day or so ago, that the Russians have destroyed another Patriot missile battery and associated radar system. There's some suggestions that this was actually a mock-up and that the Russians mistook it for a real one. I'm not in any position to say. But it's clear that the Patriot missile system cannot defend against Iskander M ballistic missiles, and it cannot defend against Zircon hypersonic missiles, which the Russians have now demonstrated in battle, and it's probably vulnerable to other Russian missiles like the Kinzhal as well. So it's not going to change the situation in the skies over Ukraine. There aren't enough Patriots. Greece has again reiterated that it will not supply Ukraine with its air defense missiles, including the S-300 system it acquired from Russia. Turkey has absolutely ruled out supplying its S-400 system from as well. Italy apparently has said that they will not provide Ukraine with another SAMP-T system. They originally had 3 of these systems. They gave Ukraine 1. That leaves them with 2. They don't want to send a second because that would leave Italy with just 1. So they're not prepared to send more of these SAMP-T systems. And even if all of these systems were sent, Russian aerial dominance is now so complete that it's difficult to believe that this is going to have any real effect on the situation in the air. There was a report yesterday that the first of the F-16s are going to finally arrive in Ukraine next month. We're not told in what number. We're not told who's going to fly them. Apparently, the training of Ukrainian pilots has not been going well, or that's what the reports say. There's been apparently different difficulties in language. A member of the Duran community made in an email, a private email to me, what I thought was an extremely good point. He said, maybe the reason training of Ukrainian pilots in flying the F-16 is not going so well because the pilots themselves are deeply unenthusiastic about flying this aircraft into the teeth of the Russian air defense system and are not keen on completing their training. Just saying. If it's not Ukrainian pilots flying these aircraft, it will presumably be Western contractors. Western contractors prepared to fly F-16s against this enormously powerful Russian air defense system, I suspect are either people who are risk takers on an astonishing scale, or people who are in extreme need of money. I have been checking out a few things about the war in the air up to this time. It does seem to be the case that the major problem for Ukrainian fighter jets is the long-range Russian missiles, both ground-launched from the S-400s and S-300s that the Russians have, but also the R-37M air-to-air missiles, which are principally launched against Ukrainian fighter jets by Russian supersonic, very high altitude, very high speed MiG-31 interceptors. And apparently, Ukrainian pilots have been complaining that the radars of the F-16s that they're being given do not have better range, significantly better range than the radars of the MiG-29s they had before, and that the missiles are actually shorter ranged than those that they used to have with their MiG-29s. Now, the latter I know is contested, but anyway, that's what we hear. So in the absence of NATO AWACS aircraft operating to support the F-16s, it's difficult to see that they can take any effective action. And of course, if NATO AWACS aircraft start participating in the conflict, then that would be direct intervention by NATO in the conflict. And the Russians have demonstrated that they have long-range missiles that are specifically designed to target and destroy NATO AWACS aircraft. So I don't think that that is what the West is going to do. So we've seen how so far the ATACMS missiles, so massively touted by commentators in the West, so far they appear to have been a failure. The Russians appear to be having no difficulty shooting them down in large numbers. They've not so far made any difference on the battlefronts. It looks to me as if all of these other military deliveries would go the same way. I've noticed, by the way, in the last couple of days, a sudden shift in British reporting about the war, especially in the Guardian newspaper, but also in some of the others, which is that some suddenly, after years of extraordinary spin about the war, giving the impression that the fighting on the battlefronts had was a little bit like, a 1960s war movie about the Second World War, the kind of film that we all remember, showing tremendously skilled Allied soldiers defeating vast numbers of incompetent Germans, that kind of thing. Anyway, we seem to have suddenly gone from that kind of reporting of the war in the British media towards, at least in the main big broadsheets, the Guardian, the Telegraph, and the others, we're suddenly seeing much more factual and honest reporting of what is in fact happening. And I wonder whether there's been a quiet recognition that the previous attempt to construct a narrative based on a movie script about the war simply will not work anymore, because the realities on the ground are now becoming so clear that they cannot be denied any longer. Just saying. Anyway, for the moment at least, it looks as if the situation is deteriorating for the Ukrainians right across the front lines, and doing so at accelerating speed. Now, let's move on and discuss something else that's happened of a political nature over the last couple of days. Now, the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, has just visited Europe. He went to Paris, where he met Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, and then he went on a very successful visit to Serbia and to Hungary, where he met the Serb president, Mr. Vučić, and the Hungarian Prime Minister, Mr. Orban. And in Hungary, he has just announced, or rather the Hungarian and Chinese governments have just announced that Hungary and China have now agreed a strategic partnership between their two countries. Note that these visits by Xi Jinping to Serbia and Hungary are taking place on the eve of a trip to China by Russian President Putin. Now, Putin has just been re-elected. He's just had his inauguration. He's moved to have his Prime Minister, Mishustin, reappointed Prime Minister. There's widespread speculation, by the way, that Mishustin, who appears to be an outstandingly capable technocrat, that Mishustin might be conceivably even been groomed to succeed Putin. I'm not going to get into the discussions or speculations about that. I have no idea one way or the other. But anyway, Putin is confidently in control of Russia. Even the Western media are acknowledging this fact. And very soon, in the next few days, he's traveling to China, where he will be meeting Xi Jinping. Now, when I previously discussed on this channel Xi Jinping's visit to Europe, I expressed some surprise that Xi Jinping would be going to Paris and then would be visiting Serbia and Hungary, two countries which are known to be in conflict with the establishment, the EU establishment in Brussels. And it did seem a little strange, but I assumed that the most important visit was the one that Xi Jinping made to Paris. After all, France, much bigger, far more powerful, far more important country than Hungary or Serbia. And in fact, if you saw some of the optics of President Xi's visit to Paris, you would think that might actually be the case. The film of President Xi's motorcade in Paris, in particular, is extraordinary. The French added to the motorcade what looks like an entire cavalry regiment, complete with trumpeters and bands and also all sorts of things. I mean, they clearly went out of their way to roll out the red carpet for Xi Jinping. But all the indications are that the meeting with Macron did not go particularly well. Macron was apparently very demanding, very critical of China's overcapacity. This has now become the meme that the Europeans are borrowing from the Americans. He was insistent that France stop flooding Europe with cheap electronic vehicles and that kind of thing. And he was also hammered away, apparently, at the wrongness of Chinese economic relations with Russia and the use of dual-use technologies by China to Russia, which supposedly is what explains Russia's ability to absorb the sanctions and to win the war in Ukraine. And all the accounts are that Xi Jinping pushed back on all of these comments or these demands from Macron. And the EU High Representative of Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, who is as antagonistic to the Russians as it gets. Anyway, he's now come out with a rather sad comment that it looks as if the Chinese are not going to shift their policy on Russia. Surprising to the Europeans, but why should anybody have thought otherwise? It's clear anyway that Xi Jinping didn't give an inch to Macron. I've now come to the view that Xi Jinping knew that all along. I think he knew perfectly well that the visit to Paris would not achieve any very positive result. I think the actual main purpose of Xi Jinping's meeting was not to have a completely fruitless and entirely pointless meeting with Macron in Paris. It was to forge closer relations with those European countries that China now sees as friendly to China, establishing a permanent Chinese foothold in Europe. And that the real business of Xi Jinping's visit was done when he visited Belgrade and Budapest. Probably Xi Jinping and the other officials of the Chinese government understood that if Xi Jinping merely visited Europe for the first time in 5 years, by the way, and only visited Hungary and Serbia, it would be seen by the European authorities and indeed the Western authorities as extremely provocative and challenging. So the Chinese decided, in order to parry that they needed to throw in a leg in the trip by going to Paris as well. And anyway, what we have had as a result is a strengthening of China's links with Hungary and Serbia on the eve of President Putin's visit to Beijing. And over a course of a program which we did on the Duran, which has not yet been published, but which will be very soon, Alex Christoforou and I had a discussion about what might eventually happen if the conflict in Ukraine ends on Russian terms. Russia might, at that point, have a secure land corridor to Hungary. And of course, Hungary has a border with Serbia. And anyway, I don't want to explore or anticipate that program too much and perhaps move too far ahead of events. We're quite a long way from that point. But it's not difficult to see a situation where the political geography of Eastern Europe might actually start to shift. Now, I say all of that because there's been a really brilliant article by that I've recently seen by Cyril Amar, in which he has made the point that for the West, this has become an incredibly dangerous situation in Ukraine. Now, the point Tariq Cyril Amar is making is this constant Western practice of first supporting Ukraine against Russia and then reinforcing Ukraine against Russia and continuing the sanctions war against Russia and trying to degrade the Russian army and weaken Russia. All of that is playing out in the opposite way to the one that was originally intended. It's increasingly looking as if instead of weakening Russia, it is the West instead that is being weakened. And its credibility, the West's credibility and its international authority is now at stake as well. Now, a similar point, by the way, to that was made way back in 2022 by the French scholar Emmanuel Todd. I remember he pointed out that from a situation where the conflict looked like it was just existential for Russia, it risks becoming, in a kind of a way, existential for Western credibility and long-term authority as well. Because if the West fails to defeat Russia in Ukraine, then the risk is that it will look the loser over a period of a geopolitical conflict when the West anyway is visibly on the retreat. So, as I said, Tariq Cyril Amar is making essentially the same point. Very well. But he's also making a further point. And I ought to say I should, he's also making a further point that because of this, there's now a real possibility that the West will want to continue the war in Ukraine indefinitely, that they're looking in some way to turn this into a forever war. And it's not difficult to understand why, because if the war, the defeat of the West in Ukraine might have these enormous geopolitical repercussions, and this possible establishment of a land corridor from China through Russia, through a Russian-friendly Ukraine to Hungary, and from Hungary to Serbia. That just provides us with one example of how that could play out. If that happens for the West, it would be a disaster, or at least the West would perceive it as such. It wouldn't actually be a disaster, but the West would perceive it as such in terms of its own global position. So they're going to want to stop that at all costs. One of the ways they're going to try to do that, no doubt, is to try to destabilize the governments in Hungary and Serbia. But they've been trying to do that for a long time, and it's proving very difficult. The alternative is to keep the Ukraine war going. And that might explain also why there is this deep unwillingness on the part, growing unwillingness, one senses, on the part of some people, even to negotiate a possible compromise. And with the Russians, because of course doing that might conceivably open the way to all of these other negative consequences that I'm talking about. So keep the war going. Keep the war going as long as one can, because otherwise all sorts of worse things will happen. It's not so much the Russians marching towards Europe, it's rather the Eurasians, the Chinese, first and foremost, achieving, on top of their already existing economic preponderance, a growing geopolitical footprint in Eastern Europe as well. And that's, as I said, something that must be stopped. So go on shoveling more weapons and aid to Ukraine. If Ukraine collapses east of the Dnieper, try and establish defense lines on the Dnieper. If that fails and the Russians cross the Dnieper, try and hold out in western Ukraine. If that happens, set up a government in exile, keep the conflict going in some form, try to keep this whole situation tense and fraught indefinitely to prevent the outcome that Emmanuel told back in 2022 and Tariq Cyril Amar are talking about, and which Xi's visit to Belgrade and Budapest might be giving more warnings of. And I think in saying that this is quite likely what the West is now thinking of trying to do, turning, in other words, Ukraine into, if not a forever war, at least into a forever conflict, I think he's absolutely right. Now, whether that can succeed is, of course, an entirely different matter. In terms of the military realities, I think that it cannot succeed. I think that it may take the Russians time. I'm not going to try to guess how much time, but if they have to grind down every resistance point in Ukraine, I think they have the political will and the resources to do it, and I think they have the intention to do it, and I think in time they will do it. I think that any idea that they would agree, for example, to Ukraine joining NATO as a mechanism to try to get the war end, I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that if the West wants a forever war in Ukraine, the Russians will say, well, they've got it, but it won't be a forever war because it will result in a clear-cut Russian victory. So I think that it won't be possible to keep the war in Ukraine going in this way indefinitely. What it will be possible to do is to devastate and destroy Ukraine. It will certainly lead to massive devastation of the country. That might be a massive economic challenge for the Russians to rebuild. But bear in mind, the Russians probably would not be on their own. The Chinese might be prepared to assist. And as I've discussed many times, and as the experience of Europe's post-war and the Soviet Union's post-war reconstruction after the Second World War shows, and as indeed I have learned from my own studies, actual post-war reconstruction is not quite as difficult as many people believe. Anyway, a forever war in Ukraine, is that what we're seeing? Possibly. But Xi Jinping's visit shows that China, and ultimately Russia too, do have friends in Europe. I think this idea to create a permanent barrier between the Russians and Europe is misconceived. A new Iron Curtain separating the Russians from the Europeans will crumble eventually, just as the old Iron Curtain did. Only this time, it will crumble from the Western side sooner than it will from the Russian. In fact, everything will reverse itself. Anyway, suffice to say that the meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin in Beijing is going to be extremely important. And it does seem to me as if going beyond the economic discussions, which of course will certainly be there, and the military ones, and the focus on the South China Sea, and all the rest, it is very likely that the Chinese and the Russians are going to be talking not just about Ukraine, but about the general situation in Europe altogether. Now, before I end this video, I'd like to say a few things about the political situation in the United States. It seems to me that President Biden is now paying the full price politically for the colossal mistake he made in October, directly after the Hamas attack on Israel, when he went to Israel and in effect gave Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check over how Israel should respond. It's now clear to me that for electoral political reasons, President Biden urgently wants the conflict in Gaza to end. He attempted to broker a ceasefire, and he made major concessions to Hamas, which of course Israel was not prepared to accept. He has now found himself in a situation where his relations with Prime Minister Netanyahu have essentially collapsed, and where he has antagonized the still very powerful body of support in the United States, which supports Israel. In fact, there have even been calls for his impeachment. All of this, even as President Biden's attempt to satisfy his base seem to be unsuccessful, because his electoral base, which is becoming increasingly unhappy about his strong support for Israel up to this point, are becoming frustrated that he continues to provide Israel with the diplomatic and political cover that he does. So he is antagonizing, upsetting both sides, as people who find themselves in this sort of situation usually do. And politically, his situation has just got worse still, because the United States has, exactly as I predicted, essentially lost control of the General Assembly and of the Security Council in the United Nations. So the General Assembly has now voted overwhelmingly to recognize Palestine as a member of the United Nations. It will be a reduced membership. Palestine, if this resolution that the General Assembly has passed by a vote of 143 votes to 9, with 25 abstentions. If you look at the 9, there are some significant countries there, Hungary being one, but most of them are small Micronesian states, essentially countries that will always support the United States in votes in the General Assembly. 25 other states, some of the US's friends in Europe. But anyway, world opinion is clear now that it wants Palestine in the United Nations. Now, as I said, in order to avoid having all US financing of the UN cut off, the General Assembly made the critical concession of saying that though Palestine would become, in effect, a kind of member of the UN, it would participate in General Assembly sessions, its officials could be appointed to agencies within the UN, it would nonetheless still not have voting rights in the General Assembly. So it falls short of full membership. But even this was too much for Israel, whose ambassador, I thought, again acted in an incredibly ill-judged way by shredding the UN Charter in the General Assembly. He was saying that it was the members of the General Assembly who were doing that by passing the resolution. But I mean, I think the very act of shredding the UN Charter in that kind of way is likely to annoy many of the other delegates. It's the kind of stunt that Israeli officials put on too often, and I think it is completely counterproductive when they do. Just saying. I think that somebody should take them aside and tell them to stop doing things like this. I don't think it helps Israel's case at all when it's done. But anyway, Israel has furiously denounced this resolution. And of course, as night follows day, the United States says that it's going to stop the resolution being implemented because it's going to veto its implementation when the matter goes to the Security Council. So, the president is caught. On the one hand, he wants a ceasefire so as to appease his base, but the Israelis are not prepared to give him the Rafah ceasefire that he's demanding. And they're furious about his announcement that weapons will not be provided by the United States to facilitate the operation in Gaza. And as I said, there's a strong body of opinion in the United States that supports the Israelis over this. And his own base is not going to be happy by the fact that he continues to protect Israel as they see it in other ways against what they see as the just cause of Palestinian statehood. Now, all of this is happening at the same time that we're seeing signs that some of the cases against the president's predecessor, Donald Trump, are starting to unravel. The documents case has been postponed indefinitely. There are problems with other cases as well. I'm not going to explore those problems in this program. But again, the picture that is not working as expected and is looking increasingly unlikely that these cases are going to prevent Donald Trump from proceeding with his presidential bid and from being a strong opponent in the election. And over and above and beyond all of this, the situation the president is in over the Middle East makes him look weak. He can't, or so it seems, bring Netanyahu and the Israeli government to heel. He's unable to exert the authority of the United States. He's coming under criticism even for the ineffective moves that he is making. And given the president's known fragilities, this isn't at all a good look. Now, I've said all along that the major mistake the president made was to give Prime Minister Netanyahu back in October the blank check that he did. It was inevitable that Prime Minister Netanyahu would cash it and would do so repeatedly and ultimately in a way that the president didn't like. But the president did that. As a result, he has lost control of the entire diplomatic process in the Middle East. And, well, he hasn't lost the election yet, and perhaps something can be pulled together. Maybe other things will turn out well for him. The election is still months away. We haven't even yet had the conventions, so one mustn't make any certain predictions. But if the election is lost, I suspect that these events that I've just been talking about will have played a certain role in bringing it about. Anyway, so what I'm going to say about all of this today, we'll be doing more programs about it, no doubt, on the Duran. But this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You'll find all sorts of amazing things there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, some amazing new lines, by the way. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to join and to check your subscription to this channel. Much going on in the world. The geopolitical tectonic plates are moving. The West is losing in Ukraine. Ukraine itself is losing and losing badly. And it's had another very bad day. And that's not even considering the political effect of this in Kiev itself, which I will no doubt be returning to in future programs. Well, thank you for joining me again. Have a good day. More from me soon.